After I graduated from school, I spent 100 days just doing backpacking. It was 30 days in Peru, then another 60 days out in the Nordics, just living in my tent every day, sleeping on top of mountains, waking up for sunrise, catching sunset. I got this one photo that ended up being featured by Nat Geo. Iceland's a country I know like the back of my head. I've been 4 times now and probably have spent close to 140 days in the country. It's my favorite country in the world. Obviously, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm incapacitated off trail somewhere because the locals were trying to warn me not to do it because quite a few people go missing in Everest area every year. The best hotel, honestly, in my opinion, is a tent on top of a mountain under the stars.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to share with you our episode with Terry Zhang, world traveler, photographer, and adventurer. We actually tried to record this episode 2 days ago when he was in Bali, but the internet wasn't cooperating, so we decided to wait until he got to Sydney, Australia. Just a bit of background on Terry before we dive into the episode. He grew up in Canada, went to a good college, and got a good first job at Boston Consulting Group, and he was actually based in Dubai for the first couple of years. In 2021, he left that job to pursue a travel company with his friend Blake called Mori Tours. For a fixed upfront price, they would take you on an action-packed adventure in Iceland with secret spots and professional-level photography and drone footage. Since his first visit, Terry has spent over 150 days in Iceland, making it one of his favorite all-time spots. Ultimately, Terry and Blake decided to part ways. Blake has gone on to start his own company in the crypto and NFT space, and Terry decided to travel non-stop for an entire year to all corners of the earth. Throughout this episode, you can just feel Terry's passion for travel. You get teleported to some of the most beautiful places on earth, and you get a glimpse into his philosophy on being an active citizen of the world. We also dig into why he hasn't posted any photos on his Instagram in the last 6 months, and how our mutual interest in climate is intertwined with all of this. I hope you enjoyed this episode of On the Rise with Terry Zhang. Really stoked to have Terry on the podcast today. Terry and I, we actually have never met. We only talked on Zoom once. But I remember, in this one conversation, we talked about our mutual love for travel, caring about climate. And I remember we also talked about potentially starting an eco village, like an eco-tourism village. And we were talking about Raja Ampat and the eco-tourism there. And now we've come full circle, and now we're talking to you on the pod. So excited to have you.
Hey guys, fantastic. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really excited to be here and have a good chat today.
Awesome. Well, it's not every day I get to meet someone who is so well traveled, doing so many things. Your Instagram just full of adventure. But I guess for myself and for, of course, our viewers who will listen to this and watch this later on, maybe you could first just tell us a little bit about who Terry, who are you? What's your childhood growing up, and where do you go to school? What are your favorite things to do? And maybe we can slowly, work our way through and to where you are now, traveling the world.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I was born in China, moved over to Toronto, Canada when I was 4, grew up in Toronto there. It's a great city, and I think I've really enjoyed traveling ever since I was young. My family took us, me and my younger brother, out camping almost every weekend in the summers, even though there's not much fun to do in Ontario because it's mostly bugs and a lot of people at the campsites and not really any mountains, but it was still something I enjoyed, just being in the outdoors since an early age. And yeah, I played a lot of sports and music growing up, mostly in piano and in orchestras. So I did have that kind of creative aspect in me. Then once I got to high school, I kind of finished my piano studies and focused on school. And for university, I went to Queen's University, studied business there. That's when the music creativity side of me kind of took a back step for studying and career. And then it was only, I guess, in my third year of college when I went on exchange. That's when I kind of really developed this travel bug. And, did the classic exchange in Europe, in Vienna, actually. Had a fantastic time. Did a lot of traveling around Europe then. And at that time, I was still quite, I guess, inexperienced as a traveler, making quite a few traveling mistakes. But I found out that it was something I really enjoyed. And I picked up my first camera that I still use today in the end of 2017. And after I graduated from school, before I started my work, I spent 100 days just doing backpacking. It was 30 days in Peru, and then flew back home for my graduation ceremony. and then another 60 days out in the Nordics. Just living in my tent every day, almost sleeping on top of mountains, waking up for sunrise, catching sunset, taking these epic photos, and having what I thought was the time of my life back then. And it really was fantastic. And I got pretty lucky with the conditions. I got this one photo that ended up being featured by Nat Geo on quite a few of their platforms, and that was really cool. And when I was using my camera for almost every day for like 3 months, the progress is quite apparent. I guess I thought I was pretty good at the beginning, but I was like looking back, I was really bad. And yeah, it's kind of like an S curve in terms of like skill development, and I got really good by the end of that trip. And then I had to go start my job, which was also another adventure. So my first job, I was working at BCG, Boston Consulting Group, based out of Dubai. And that was a really cool experience to go to the Middle East to experience the culture and the work there. And it was also fantastic for travel because in the Middle East, they have much more vacation time, about 5 weeks of public holidays a year compared to North America. And the public holidays are all consecutive. So it's not like in Canada, US, where you have random one day trip holidays. You can't really go to Europe or Southeast Asia in like a 3-4 day weekend. But no, and from Dubai, so much was possible. Going to Europe, Africa, Central Asia. It was really at the epicenter of travel with connections. And I definitely took advantage of that while I was in Dubai. I worked there for about 2 years and yeah, made enough money to eventually go and do this trip. But yeah, during the pandemic, my original plan was actually to leave my job and do a 2-year trip during right before the pandemic started. But of course, once COVID happened, and plans in the world changed, and so did mine. So I was a bit stuck and not sure of what to do. I ended up quitting anyways because I felt I didn't feel fulfilled with what I was doing. I mean, don't get me wrong, I had a great time at BCG and learned a lot of tremendous like professional skills and I think important skills that will be useful for me later on in my career. But I thought it was the time to move on. And then right around that time, actually, one of my other really close friends, he was quitting Facebook. And we said, hey, let's maybe work together and do some cool things. So we moved back to Toronto to kind of grind, and we weren't sure what to really do. But I always had this kind of longing to start my own like travel company. And it's not really, like a SaaS company or the hot startups that people look into these days, but it was something I had always wanted to do. So in just a month and a half, we set up this amazing website that, a lot of people gave us great reviews for. And we pushed out this travel company and we got actually, and I guess the premise of the company was offering really unique and differentiated travel experience for high net worth clients. You noticed for that particular customer segment, the products on the market were really quite lackluster. And yeah, like with my photography eye, I knew how to construct the perfect itinerary to take people to these really off the beaten path places and give them a much better experience than all my competition. So even though we launched the website and in less than a month, I got enough bookings for like 7 or 8 trips for the summer, which was it blew my mind, honestly, like hit 6 figures in revenue with like no like testimonials or kind of any proof of validity or reinforcement, social reinforcement. So that was pretty much a surprise, to be honest. And the first summer it worked out fantastic. And then eventually my friend, he decided it wasn't really for him. And I knew like he had bigger passions in blockchain space. So now he's working on a really cool startup and they've raised quite a large round. So working on like the NFT marketplace. So I mean, should drop a link, check it out. His name's Blake Brown and JPEG. Really cool startup, and they're gonna do great things.
Terry, I actually messaged Blake telling him that we were going to do this pod and asked him for any questions that he is just wondering or would be good to ask you. And actually, it's interesting that you had the plan pre-COVID to do the 2-year travel because in many cases, you've come full circle because you're doing exactly what you planned in the beginning. But I'm really curious about, hopefully we can talk a little bit more about Mori, the name of the travel company that you're talking about. I'm really curious what it was like in the early days when you and Blake knew you wanted to work together. How did you come up with the right offering in terms of like the product and the service? How did you come up with 2 weeks in Iceland? What was that process like? Did you have any other locations in mind? Were there other activities that you thought would be good to include in this package? How did you think about starting it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can answer a bit on that. To me, actually, it was super easy. I think it's because I had blueprints already in mind from way before. Iceland's a country I know like the back of my head. It's I've been like 4 times now and probably have spent like close to 140 days in the country. It's definitely my favorite, most like it's my favorite country in the world, and it's pretty easy to see why if you have been. It's simply a very stunning country. You see on Instagram like there's so many fantastic like locations in Iceland. A lot of them are quite hidden, so only the best of the best photographers know them. But I'm always like trying to figure out these places too, because usually the best photo locations, because they're still remote, you're also usually the only one there, which just heightens the experience because you don't have to be bothered by large crowds. And yeah, to answer a bit more about Matt's question, when I was actually during the COVID, I was traveling in Kenya with Blake and a few other guys, and we were doing a safari. And I had this revelation there because, we were doing it pretty cheap, still staying at a really nice, like, glamping hotel, but we were paying like $50 a day per person for like full board. And we're having lunch out in the savannah one day, and beside us was this couple who they were paying like $3,000 for a night on top of this really luxurious resort. But their experience at the end of the day was more or less the same as ours. And, we're having lunch in the savannah. They were getting like sparkling water and some wine offerings instead of us, but our simple box lunch. But the animals were the same. The bugs were biting all of us nonetheless. And that's when I realized, right now in the travel market, for the high net worth folks, they pay a lot more, but usually the product itself is more or less the same, and just paying for better accommodation and food. But a lot of people want differentiated travel experiences, things that when they go home and tell their friends either at like parties or gatherings, something unique that really makes them like stand out from their peers and their travels. So I thought that was a really interesting space to play in, and I already knew all like these GPS locations in Iceland and getting there, so it's like pretty easy to construct itinerary. And I guess also I'm pretty experienced at recommending itineraries to people in general. So just as a side note, if you're ever traveling anywhere, feel free to shoot me a message. I have all these bookmarks, ideas, like hacks. It's just something I love doing. And so I thought like, yeah, it's quite easy to set up, honestly. There's no real barriers there. In the early days, I guess the other thing about Iceland is the country, the landscape is so diverse and unique. Every day you feel like you're doing something completely different. You feel like you're on a different planet. One day you feel like you're on set for Lord of the Rings, then you're on Mars, then you're on like this black barren, like volcanic sand desert. So it's just like every day the experience feels like a different trip. So by the end of like the 8-day trip, you feel like you've done 8 different trips each day. And
I'd love to go back to, before we go to like Matt's question, like you founding it and working with Blake, can you just give a quick summary of Maury? What is the experience like? You said it was 8 days. Who are the people coming over? Where do they stay? And what kind of stuff do you have planned as their guide?
Yeah, it's basically almost a week, like 8 days, 7 nights in Iceland, and it's essentially a private tour. So I just take like individual client groups, and I essentially rent these big like off-road capable vehicles, like a Toyota RAV4 or Land Cruiser, depending on the party size, and take them around the island for the week, put them up in like pretty nice hotels, and cover all the meals every day. We eat at pretty nice restaurants. And yeah, the typical itinerary, because usually when I travel, I like to cram my days full with stuff to do. And so, yeah, usually all my clients got pretty, I guess, exhausted and wanted some more time to rest by the end. But that's always something I want to deliver upon, because I feel like, for me, it's honestly a bit of a pet peeve when I see people travel and I feel like they don't get the most out of their vacation time, whether or not it be missing out on things to do or just not planning things efficiently and missing out on things because they didn't know or they didn't have the foresight to kind of accommodate that into their plans. So yeah, usually it's pick up early in the morning and we do a bunch of hiking. And because I'm also a really avid photographer, I take photos and drone videos for my clients for free, and that's something they really enjoy as well. It's almost like, having your own personal photographer. And yeah, there's definitely some really nice memories just from that during the summer. If I try to recall now, one of my friends, my clients, they were actually my colleagues back from Dubai. They actually proposed over in Iceland and got these really amazing candid proposal photos, which I think are some of the best in the world simply because of the backdrop. The backdrop was like straight out of Lord of the Rings with this mountain and waterfall, and it was a really amazing time. So yeah, I think that's definitely a passion of mine, using my photography skills to capture moments and share them with people. And yeah, I think it was definitely a very fun summer. My clients are asking me, "Oh, you've been doing the same itinerary for like quite a few different clients now. Don't you get bored doing the same things?" And my answer was like, no, because usually when I travel alone, it's purely for taking the photo or seeing the sights for myself. But then when I'm leading clients, it's a very different equation. It's a very different purpose. I get all my satisfaction from seeing the thrill and excitement for my clients when they see a spot for the first time. And when I feel like I really delivered on my value proposition and they say like, wow, like, I expected something beautiful, but I didn't expect something like this. Like some of the words they said was simply just made my heart feel very happy and felt like I was doing the right thing. And this actually resonated with something my safari driver from Kenya said, because he had been doing like driving safari tours for like 20 years. And I asked him the same thing, you're still passionate still after 20 years of driving the same roads, looking at the same animals. What gets you up in the morning with that level of passion? And he said simply it comes down to seeing my guests, how excited they are to see the cheetahs for the first time or the lions. I guess I didn't appreciate that until I stepped into his shoes, but it definitely makes a lot of sense.
Can you take us to that moment where you're deciding, what do I do next? Do I keep running Maury solo? What are my other options? And then how did you ultimately end up where you're at now, where you kind of came back to your original goal of traveling for a full year?
So when I finished the tours, came back to Toronto, I was thinking, what do I do now? The tours are quite nice, were quite fun and quite profitable for the summer, but the Iceland summer season is quite short. It's just about 2.5 months, so it's not enough, of course, for the whole year. One idea was to expand my product offering to more destinations, and then just eventually cycle through many different spots in the world throughout the year, capitalizing on the seasonality of each. For example, like it'd be something like Jan, Feb in New Zealand, March, April in Patagonia, May in Peru, like June, July, August in Iceland, September, October, maybe in like the Swiss Alps, then head back home to relax. And basically running the same thing in all these locations, fill up the calendar year and essentially make money doing what I love to the point where work doesn't feel like work. Because during the summer when I was leading the tours, I honestly felt like one of the happiest folks alive. So I felt like I was making money doing what I love and making other people happy by delivering value. And that's something that I think is really important for me when I work, just getting that sense of fulfillment and being close to the customers to actually see their reaction. It's very different from, I guess, working behind the laptop and being a bit more insulated and detached from seeing the fruits of your efforts.
And for the people that are going to be watching this or listening to this, like to give them context, can you just really quickly summarize your year of travel?
Cool. Yeah. So I started in August. I spent 35 days in Pakistan. Really beautiful country, amazing mountain. You're completely alone in the mountains. If you like hiking, it's the best place to be. Then I went down to Vietnam late September for 20 days. Late September is the best time to go to Vietnam because the rice fields in the north are all golden and being harvested. So it's just fantastic for photography and hiking through the rice fields in like probably the best season. After I went to Nepal for 45 days, a lot of trekking there. Once again, if you love the mountains, it's absolutely fantastic. Just being in the highest, like surrounded by the highest mountains there in the world. I did climb a 6,200 meter mountain, which is, I guess, almost 19,000 feet. That was like really, really cool. Definitely one of the highlights in my travel career. And after Nepal, I went down to Thailand just for a week. The main goal there was for the Yipen Festival, Lantern Festival, which happens 2 days a year and usually in November, where they release the lanterns into the sky. It's a really stunning, I guess, performance ceremony, and I was like really blown away by it. Usually I'm not a big fan of these like touristy things, but that was definitely the exception. Then after Thailand, I focused mostly on diving for the last 2 or 3 months. So I went down to Malaysia, Borneo to go diving in Sipadan. Sipadan's like supposedly one of the best dive sites in the world. And it's still great, but it was kind of sad to see how much worse it's gotten in the last like 4 or 5 years. And maybe we can touch upon this a bit later because it's something that I'm quite keen to talk about, just kind of the direction the world's heading in terms of the environment. After Sipadan, I went down to Indonesia and spent 2 months in Indonesia, mostly going to very remote places. A lot of great diving, some of the best dive sites in the world. Some highlights include snorkeling with like 4 or 5 whale sharks for 3 hours a day, like being the only ones in the water, and or like being the only ones in the water, being surrounded by like 10 manta rays for like over an hour. Just some really, really beautiful moments that I'll definitely cherish for the rest of my life. And yeah, eventually made my way back to like Bali and a more touristy area, and then flew down to Australia where I'm here in Australia now for about 2 weeks. Now looking forward, I'll be going to New Zealand in February for almost 40 days of hiking, and then over to Patagonia for 50 days of hiking as I work my way up from like the bottom of Chile up to Peru. Then about like a month and a half planned in Peru to go more hiking in the mountains. As you can tell, I love hiking in mountains and just taking pictures in the mountains. It's like where I love to be. And then after Peru, I'm kind of undetermined. There's quite a few options, and I'll probably just see where the wind takes me. But I do want to go down to French Polynesia later in August, potentially. Flying from like SF to Tahiti round trip is decently affordable. And Tahiti, around French Polynesia in August, it's the humpback whale season. It's also like they have some really wicked dives where you can see up to 400 sharks in a single dive, which is just completely crazy. And they also have nice hiking there, so it's something maybe I'll try to fit in, but we'll see.
When you first gave us your intro, you talked about your month study abroad and how you made a lot of travel mistakes and you learned from that. And now you've given full-blown tours through some of your favorite places. So curious if you could share some of your wisdom from having been an inexperienced traveler to an experienced traveler to a guide, and what you think creates the best experience for people when they go out and see a new place.
I think making mistakes at the beginning is just instrumental to getting better. The more mistakes you make, the faster you improve, and it's just that simple. I think the biggest one, was like when I went to Morocco, all my friends were saying, oh, Morocco's kind of sketchy, you need to book your tour in advance on all of this. And so I booked the same tour operator that my friends had used, and I ended up paying like a 60% premium. Because then when I got on the ground and we're in a minivan, I realized like I was a completely like fresh traveler at the time. I didn't know how things worked. Then I realized, there's so many different tour operators, but they just funnel all the tourists to the same like minivan essentially. So I was talking with the other guys in the van and found out, they paid much lower than me because they just got to the spot and arranged. And so that was like a pretty dumb mistake, and that's something I tell all my friends now. It's like if you're ever, Europe's a bit different, but for anywhere in South America or Asia, you never book your stuff in advance because you're paying like a huge premium online. It's always better to arrange when you arrive on site.
I think one part that sticks out to me is you smiling and being so happy about some honestly experiences that might terrify. Like swimming with 400 sharks, I can imagine as being one of the most beautiful yet terrifying experiences. And I think I saw one of your stories about you cave diving or something pretty tricky and treacherous. So I'm wondering, did you have any moments where you felt genuinely worried or scared?
Yeah, I think the most anxiety I had on my trip was earlier in Pakistan, where on the side, my dad actually joined me for Pakistan. My dad loves hiking as well, and my mom ended up forcing my dad to come with me because she thought, Pakistan's dangerous and it's not safe for you to go alone, which is totally like BS in the end. Because Pakistan's it's a very nice and safe country. Don't believe what Western media says. Of course, there's like bad parts, but like that's the same with like any like city in the U.S., right? Like the places you go for tourism are perfectly safe. Anyways, like we had this sunrise hike planned where we would go up this 5,000, like almost 16,000 feet mountain. And there was like no trail. There was a lot of rock scrambling. And because we're starting at 2 a.m., I was actually a bit nervous because neither of us had been that high before. Like the highest I had been was 15,000 feet. So like an extra like 1,200 feet. Of course, with the high elevation, you never know. There's like no signal. I had a satellite phone, but still, it's because there's no path and the rock scrambling was quite dangerous. Actually, the the incline was like almost 40 degrees, which was like very steep, like
That's
with the
really
sharp
steep.
boulders. Yeah, it was like really steep, and we didn't know the path, and it was all in the dark. We're just using our headlamps. Like I definitely had some anxiety because, of course, if you slip, it's pretty bad. But I think having my dad there with me was actually really important for my kind of like confidence that we'd be able to make it. It's just crazy how just hiking with someone else gives you so much more comfort. And yeah, I mean, we made it up because we trusted our ability. And of course, it was well within our ability to scramble up to the top, and we made it to the top. But that was definitely a moment where I was quite scared. Another moment, it was also in Pakistan actually. There was this one place I really wanted to go to. It's like the Mecca for rock climbing, and they call it Pakistan's Yosemite. But I had only seen like one or two pictures on Google and almost nothing on Instagram. This was like a really remote hidden gem. There's like no trip reports, no blogs, nothing on Instagram or social media, not even no trail on Maps.me or on the topography. Just the locals saying, yeah, you turn here, follow this bridge, turn there, and then you get there, right? So that was, I
Is
think,
there
the
a name?
most exciting. Yeah, it's called a Nangma Valley. It's if you like rock climbing and if you like Yosemite, this has to be like on top of your bucket list because it's like 20 times better than Yosemite and there's like no one around. It has like insane rock climbing, granite like everywhere, and you're really high up and you're really like in the middle of nowhere. So to give you a sense of how adventurous it was, like there's no hiking trail. We were just following like yak paths, and there was a point where we totally missed this turn to go across the bridge. And then I realized like something was wrong because I thought we were supposed to be on the other side of the river. So I actually had to fly my drone for like 10 minutes up and down the river. And then I found the bridge that we are supposed to cross. And that just gives you a sense of like the level of adventure for that hike. Like we lost the trail maybe 3, 4 times. Then we overshot the switchbacks to actually go up the valley because we thought it was too steep. And then we walked forward and then like the river was like too steep, too deep to cross. Then we traced back and thought, okay, this has to be the only way up. So like the whole journey was a very much an adventure. But when we got to the top, it was like really stunning. But to go back to answer your question, I had never had so much uncertainty before going on a hike. Like basically broke the number one rule of hiking, which is like know where you're going, like either with a map or GPS or whatever. But we had no idea. But that level of experience is also, I think, something that is so hard to come by because nowadays so much of the world is explored. You kind of know what you're
Right.
getting into, and I think that takes away some of the elements of travel. Where if you think back to the early age days of like even the first explorers, right? They had no map. They were just like going around and they were chartering their own map. And I think that level of exploration is something that I had always wanted to experience safely, of course. And then all the anxiety melted away into like satisfaction. And actually, speaking of that, I had just remembered another moment that this was probably actually the most anxious I felt the whole trip. So this was in Nepal. And Nepal, I had found on Google Earth this really beautiful mountain lake. It was about 15,500 feet in elevation, so about 5,300 meters. It was off the trail and there's no signal or anything, but I really wanted to get to this lake because it had the perfect reflection of the most beautiful mountain in the Everest area, Madablam, which is like perfectly pyramidal. So if you can imagine lake with that mountain reflection at sunset, those are like, that's like a photographer's wet dream. But like, I wasn't sure about getting up there because it was, it was off trail. So obviously a lot of dangers involved. I have a satellite phone in case anything goes wrong, but obviously you don't want to go to that situation. And a bit more backstory into this. So I had actually first done a hike on the other side of the valley to go up to the base camp. And from there, the other side, I can like kind of peer into the side I wanted to climb up. And I took a bunch of pictures. I always study on Google Earth and topography, understand the routes and where it might be too dangerous just to try to plan my trip. So I had done all this planning and figured out, okay, the optimal way to get up to this lake is to cut in from like here and zigzag up. And then I can't miss this ridge line, otherwise it gets too dangerous. So I had like all these plans in place. And then when I started the hike, it was basically like 40% like incline going up. And I took a lot of breaks because, I just didn't want to like twist my ankle or do anything.
Were
And
you alone?
it's actually the first time I was completely alone. So no guide. I told my like brother about my plans and he knew about my like the GPS of my location. And I had like the supplies to like, if I had to like stay up there for like an extra night, I could like survive. But obviously, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm like incapacitated off trail somewhere because the locals were trying to warn me not to do it because quite a few people go missing in Everest area every year, and you see the missing signs, and that honestly makes me like gives me more trepidation. But like I knew this trail that I was doing, there was no like exposure, so I didn't have to worry about like slipping and falling off a cliff, and it was just like a simple hike up and then coming back down. And then when I got to the top, when I got to the lake, it was like I can't describe this experience, but all the anxiety, all the like nervousness inside my body, it completely melted away. And then instead it was filled with pure euphoria. Like getting to this lake, being probably the first person there to take these epic photos. And the conditions were perfect too, which was a real blessing because the weather had been really bad in Nepal, not a lot of visibility. And even when I got to the lake, there's still a lot of challenges. It took like 20 minutes of hopping along boulders to get to the other side of the lake. I set up my tripod and like put it on time-lapse mode, and it took me 20 minutes to go back to pose to get this really epic selfie. It was definitely one of the top photo moments of my trip. I think probably the top photo moment. And I was staying for sunset. Then the weather started turning bad, and then I decided to head down a bit early because a lot of fog started creeping in. And this is when in hindsight, I probably screwed up. So I thought, okay, I'll hike down in the dark, no problem. I have a headlamp. But what I didn't account for was this thick fog. And because I was off trail, I didn't know, I had a general like understanding of how to go and some reference points. But then when I started descending into the fog, my visibility was reduced to literally just like less than a meter. I can only see like around my feet. And I had no idea like when I was supposed to turn to get to like the safe areas. And I was honestly very spooked out. And I started slipping a bit and rushing and panicking. And I thought like, man, this is actually turning really bad with the fog because I really couldn't see anywhere. And because there's no trail, it was just rocks everywhere. So it was actually super dangerous at that point. And so then like, I took a couple of minutes to calm myself down because when you're nervous, you never make the right decisions. So I calmed myself down and then I started thinking rationally. And I remembered with my GPS watch, I have a mode called Traceback, which I can see visually the line that I took to get up. And then I can use that as a reference point going back. So I can see, approximately when I need to turn. And then combined with like using Maps.me and my elevation, which my watch was telling me, I was able to piece together, like, figure out how to get back safely. It was definitely super harrowing as an experience, and I feel like I'm a really experienced hiker, and that probably got me out of it. I think if for any novice hiker, like they would have been really screwed because it was a really scary situation. And after that, I decided, I'm never gonna do like off-trail hiking alone if I'm coming back in the dark, just because, I didn't account for the fog, and it was such a game changer. I think without the fog, I would have been okay, but it was just so scary, and I've never been that scared before while hiking, and so it was enough to scare me to not do something like that again. But yeah, it was definitely a scare.
I'm actually curious about what you purposely left out. Like when I think about that spreadsheet that you posted on your story of like literally down to the day, back to back, no rest. I'm actually curious about what you didn't put into your year of travel. Like you don't have a lot of breaks. You don't have a lot of chill days. You don't have a lot of socializing or meeting up with friends around the world. Can you talk about your mindset going into planning this trip?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my friends would describe me as intense. I love to maximize all my vacation days when I travel. And so I'm always going hardcore, like waking up for every sunrise, catching every sunset, catching up on sleep, like in transport. When I tell people I travel for a year, it seems like such a long time. You have so much time to do so many things. But even for me, it feels so rushed because I'm trying to squeeze so much in as humanly as possible. In terms of like rest days, so when I plan my trip on my itinerary, like what I do is here are the must-have days that I need to do for diving or photography or for hiking. And then I'll just add like a buffer of like 5 to 10, like depending on the time. Like Patagonia, I have 50 days set aside. I really only need like 30 days. Then the remaining 20 days is for like, weather buffers or for resting between hikes. So that's kind of how I've planned things. Yeah, same with in Nepal when I was hiking. I was doing like pretty aggressive hikes every day. But then I had enough weather buffers so that for the bad weather days I can rest and recharge. And that's how things usually work out. It's honestly been a bit more tiring than I expected because I'm like an extrovert and introvert. Like I get a lot of social energy from chatting with people when I travel, but I also need my alone time to just reflect and decompress and kind of do my own thing. I'm someone who gets so much energy from seeing places. Like to me, rest is hiking in the mountains and seeing like a really epic sunrise. Because I think the energy I get from that is so much more positive and impactful than, let's say, sitting in a cafe and being on my phone. And in terms of also like talking to people, it's during my trip, I've met so many cool folks, like other people doing trips around the world, or even older folks. Like something I find in my travel is the people with the best travel stories are like the older folks who are maybe in their 50s or 60s. Everything they've seen before, it's much more, I guess, like virgin or raw, like the travel experience compared to what we know now. And I always love talking to like these older folks because their travel experiences are just so much cooler than what most of us will ever have. And it's something that I definitely yearn for. Yeah, I definitely enjoy my chats with them.
I think you're such a good telescope into experiences of very unique pockets of people around the world, and our viewers and myself included, I'm sure would really love to hear some of those conversations and perspectives on life that you just can't get either living in the US or Canada. So I'm wondering if you had any really special moments that you were able to share with us from people that you saw or even other fellow travelers.
So I meet a lot of couples who are also traveling around the world for a year. When I asked them, what they were doing before, their occupation was definitely not as high paying as I guess most of our colleagues in our network, but they still made enough money to travel the world to pursue their dreams, to live their life, and probably have the time of their life in the 20s or early 30s. And I think that was just something that I found really nice, realizing that you don't need a lot of money to go pursue your dream or to travel the world. I think the biggest barrier is actually just like going for it, taking that leap of faith. And yeah, when I compare like the people I meet versus the people like my friends who are still working, it's like two very different worlds, right? And of course the grass is always greener. Like we're always looking at, at least for me, I'm looking at my colleagues that I left behind and, oh, they're making much more money than me now and I'm kind of behind in that career wise. But then like they're looking at me in terms of experiences and definitely yearning to go and have all these experiences before, because it's hard to do all of this while you're still working full time, right? And so I guess a lot of the conversations just center around, how do you balance career versus travel, and if you even need to have some balance at all. And my answer to that has always been like finding balance in imbalance. For me, like I think working really hard for 2 years and making enough money to then travel really hard for like 1+ years and not have to worry about budget. Like that's definitely my preferred way of going about doing it. Because when I travel, I want to be fully traveling. I don't want to be distracted from, having to work or having to update blogs or like do any of that stuff, vlogging. So that's why I kind of keep that stuff to a minimal when I travel. Even the photo processing and updating on Instagram, it takes more effort than I would like. So that's why recently I haven't been doing it, just because I want to really enjoy being in the moment. And there's time to do all of that when the travel ends. But yeah, I think that's another topic too, just living in the moment. I think back at home, we're on our phones so much and so much time is put on presenting ourselves on social media. And then when you're traveling, I can sit here for an hour and put together like my next stories in my experience. Or I can just go enjoy this conversation with these divers when we just had like the best dive of our life. And I always opt for like the latter, to be in a moment, and it's been nice, yeah.
I have a question. It's actually on the topic of budgeting and packing. And so I've seen your stories on what you're traveling with, what's in your pack. And I'm curious, are you traveling this way because of how you needed to budget so that you could travel for a year? Or if you had even more money, you would still be traveling just as light, just as basic as you are?
Yeah, definitely. I would still be traveling the same. Like for me, I've never really enjoyed staying in hotels. It's just not my style of travel. I usually prefer like hostels anyways because they're better for talking with people. And the best hotel, honestly, in my opinion, is a tent on top of a mountain under the stars. In terms of like my pack, it's about like 20 kilos right now, which is quite heavy, but like almost half of it's like my camera and drone equipment. Yeah, and It sucked a bit carrying my tent and my sleeping bag for like through Southeast Asia because I haven't really had to use it. But it'll be important later for New Zealand, Patagonia, and Peru. And it's just the way I've been traveling for a long time because if you really want to go into the mountains, you need like to be self-sufficient, like tent and cooking wise. And I'd always want to do like a, let's say 5, 6 day hike in a mountain rather than staying in a hotel or hostel and doing like day trips because you just don't see the same things. You don't catch Milky Ways, you don't see like sunrise, sunsets, and it's like a totally different experience. Yeah.
Awesome. I have a question similar to this experience piece, which is I think I saw on your social media something around like traveling the world without a care in the world. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what your stressors were prior to, when you're working in corporate or at school, and then what, if any, stressors you have now that you're sort of traveling the world without a care.
Back when I was working, a lot of the anxieties or stresses come around, I guess, performance on the job, right? Like everyone wants to do a good job, and I was working a pretty stressful job, so the expectations were pretty high. And in general, I find like in North America, because everyone works pretty high stressing, high paying jobs, but like a lot of our anxieties, I think, are so self-engineered. You think, oh, I'm not good enough for this interview, or I'm not good enough for this position, or like I don't think I can make it. There's like a lot of self-doubt because the competition is that fierce, right? It's kind of crazy. And stepping away and now traveling, my only concerns are, where do I sleep for the day? Where am I going to take a picture, and how am I going to feed myself? It's like very, very basics. It goes down to the basics. And it's honestly very, I guess, I mean, it's, how do I put it? It's like some very basic problem solving, right? It's like how to get from A to B and kind of figuring stuff out on the spot every day. You have to be pretty creative and resourceful. I don't really feel any anxieties. I guess the only anxieties I feel when I travel are, okay, I have a flight connection. I can't oversleep and miss that. So I, set up a lot of alarms and get my parents to call me in case as well. But when I say I'm traveling without a care, it's really just nice to let go of all these anxieties that I had felt when I was working that I think are self-engineered, and in reality, like there's absolutely no need for me to put myself through that mental state. And it's honestly been very, very nice. I think actually I had just weighed myself the other day at the airport because they had a nice scale. And like I've gotten a lot more muscle back just by traveling. I've been like sleeping and waking very early every day. I've been getting up at almost like 5 a.m. every day for like 5 months now. It's just been a really awesome feeling. Compared to back when I was working in corporate, I was like always snoozing till like 10 minutes before my Zoom calls or the day would start. And I would always be like a night owl. And getting up early in the morning is just such a nice feeling, even before like my alarm sounds. Eating healthy, hiking every day. It's just, I don't think I've been healthier in my life. And it really reflects in like my mental state, my happiness, and it's something that can't really put a price tag on. And it's definitely something I value a lot more now moving forward when I go back to work, wherever that might be. Just putting a lot more emphasis on taking care of myself, because I definitely wasn't doing enough of that before, especially during the pandemic.
On the topic of content creation, I feel like you're the opposite of those influencers that look up the coolest spots and they're like, oh, can you take a picture for me? And then trying to get all the angles, and then they spend the next 30 minutes figuring out which picture to post on their story and trying to like figure out the algorithm and stuff. I've noticed on your Instagram, you occasionally post stories, but you actually haven't made a single post since your year of travel started.
Yeah.
But there's so much stuff I know that you haven't posted yet. So I'm really curious, just zooming out a bit, what is your philosophy on sharing your travel experiences, sharing content, and then also more on the tactical level, like what's your actual plan with this entire catalog of stuff you've shot?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the main reason I haven't been posting on Instagram, like actual posts, is because I want to do it properly. I felt for me to make that commitment while I travel would just distract me too much from my actual travels. Because to actually make like a good post, especially now with the reels, you need to spend some time processing it, picking the right song, picking the right time, the hashtags, everything. It's actually like decent work, relatively speaking. And I didn't want that to be an additional distraction while I traveled. I'd rather just be enjoying a moment rather than trying to summarize it. And for me, my photography is always about capturing the essence of a moment. Like I want to get the right picture or the right video to really encapsulate all that I'm feeling in that moment. So when I open that media up later, I feel like I'm transported back to the time I was experiencing that incredible sunset or doing that like crazy hike, walk across that bridge. But when I go home, I think I'm going to sit down, put all like the pictures I've taken through all my trips, like going back to like 2018, and just organize them all, put them into a really nice catalog. And yeah, because a lot of people have asked me for prints so far, and I told them, hey guys, like yeah, happy to hear your interest. I'm only traveling with my phone right now, so I can't really do any proper editing on the laptop. Some people have also asked me like, are you gonna write a book about it? I was thinking like, gosh, like writing a book would be so much effort, and like I'm probably not gonna do something like that just because the time investment, and I feel like to write a proper book, you'd really need to have interesting stories to share. Of course, I have interesting stories, but I feel like if I were to write a book, I'd have to spend like maybe a month living with like in a remote setting to really tell the story of how the people live there.
There is something you mentioned earlier that I do think you're pretty uniquely positioned to talk about, and it was like the climate aspect. I know I'm
Right,
sure like
right.
being an avid traveler, like climate change is something that's on your mind, and obviously you want to be one to preserve the environment. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are around that, and if you've ever thought about using your photography or stories to sort of promote anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I can talk about on climate. I'll first talk about what I've experienced so far on my trip. Then I'll talk about my thoughts on where I think the world's going. And then finally, I'll talk about like how photography can potentially aid in that. So it's been quite disheartening, honestly, to see like the impact that we're having everywhere. So in the mountains, almost everywhere, the glaciers are retreating. And later when I go to Patagonia, there's this one big glacier that's just been receding year over year. And it's just quite sad to think about that. The forests, the rainforests a lot of them are being cut down. When I was in Malaysia, Borneo, a lot of the rainforests were already replaced by palm oil plantations. It's quite sad. When I was diving in Sipadan, the dive master said, 10 years ago, they used to see 70, 80 sharks in a day, easy, like guaranteed. And when we were diving there, we would see maybe like 5 or 6 sharks. And
Wow.
a big reason for that is because the water temperature has risen by a couple of degrees. And as a result, that allows some fungus to grow on the shark's heads. And this is killing them. And the scientists are still trying to figure out why this bacteria, like where did it come from? They think it's because of the elevated like temperature in the water. But yeah, like that just really, really sucks. And then going to Raja Ampat, which is supposedly the last paradise for diving in the world. It's gotten worse in the last 2, 3 years alone. So I was speaking with some older German folks who this is like their 5th time there. And they said like in the last 3 years, it's gotten so much worse. Mostly because of like commercialization. A lot more liverboards bringing inexperienced divers to these sites. And also the boats themselves, like really big boats like doing stupid things like being too close to the reefs, divers underwater like kicking the corals because they're not experienced enough in the currents, and just overall like you can see the damage in some of the coral sites, which is unfortunate. Of course, there's many sites that are still very pristine, but I already got the feeling that Raja Ampat as a dive site is a place that's probably just on the precipice of a decline, which is sad to think about because it's honestly, I think the best dive spot in the world. Now I'm in Australia, and of course, like a lot of heat waves. But this year there's been a lot of flooding, and it's just like everywhere I go, like you see the craziness of like what's going on in the world, like climate wise, and it's quite sad. In terms of where I think we're headed, I used to be quite optimistic, but I'm unfortunately very pessimistic about the situation right now. I think like my view of it is just not enough people of influence care, and it's as typical humans like we won't care about something until it's too late. Then we'll react to that. By that time, the damage would have been done. I know it's very pessimistic and it's kind of undermining the efforts of everyone fighting the battle right now, but I just feel like the damage being done is so great. Like all the all the people fighting the battle, of course, it's very noble, but I feel like it's for a losing cause, as defeatist of a mindset as that sounds. Something else, actually, I didn't mention earlier, but like plastic and garbage. This was something that was blowing my mind. So there's so much plastic in the ocean. Of course, everyone knows that, but then when you're diving, you actually see it firsthand. It adds a whole different level to it. And a lot of the plastic actually isn't even from the islands. The currents just take them in from elsewhere. And and then and this is something I need to do a bit more reading about. But in North America, I think, oh, we have proper waste management solutions. We throw out plastic in the recycling bin, our garbage and properly, and then everything gets taken care of. But that's just like a very, I guess, naive take on the situation. Out of sight, out of mind. It's not really causing problems. But a lot of, excuse me, a lot of Western countries end up, selling their garbage and to Southeast Asian countries, where it invariably ends up getting burned or thrown into the ocean, just because we're running out of landfill sites, and that's, I guess, just the reality of it. And I plan to do a bit more research and reading into the exact supply chain of how garbage and plastic flows. But yeah, it's honestly quite crazy. Like China used to buy plastic from like your EU countries because they had like plastic recycling plants to make economic value out of it. We stopped doing that recently, and it's so now these countries just send their plastic to like Vietnam or Indonesia, and then it just ends up in the oceans, which is quite sad. And when I was like, diving in Indonesia, there's like no garbage sites anywhere. So the plastic I had with me, I had to choose like, do I throw it in the ocean or do I bring it back to land where they just burn it? And I'm actually also quite curious to see like which one has a bigger like environmental impact. Like I'm pretty sure throwing it into the ocean is less detrimental because when you burn it, it releases like these like toxins into the atmosphere and just accelerates like heating, which is probably worse than being in the ocean, even though being in the ocean is like worse for like a diver like me. But yeah, I just think it's quite terrible the general direction we're headed in. And now to the final point I want to discuss in terms of what can we do about it. And this is actually one of my main motivations behind Mori tours. I was asking myself, okay, how can I get more people to care about the environment like I do? Like, why do I care so much, right? It's because I love traveling. And why do I love traveling? It's because I go to all these beautiful places and I get to see how beautiful they are, and it makes me want to protect it. And I think that's the same for most people. So then the question becomes, how can we get more people to care about these places? Well, people would care more if they got out and saw more of the world, right? And I think photography is a really important element to that. If I'm able to capture these really beautiful places, that would give people a reason to protect them. I think that's a potential solution because, yeah, like right now it's hard to care about the environment, and when you're just sitting at home and not really seeing these places, right? And so that's why I think travel is a really nice vehicle to get people to appreciate the world more and to understand what we're doing to harm it. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely not easy, but I think more people just need to get out and see these places before we end up destroying them. And yeah, once you see them, you start making small changes in your lifestyle to just, small sacrifices that you feel goes a small way. But I mean, this whole another discussion on where the burden of climate change falls under. Is it under like the micro actions of the everyday consumer? Or is it under like, the couple of really big companies that contribute like 80-90% of the actual like damage? And it's a bit fallacious to think, as consumers, we can make a big impact, because if you can get a couple of these really big companies to make changes, then that goes a lot further. But, it's obviously very difficult, like the latter path. And you start with what you can control, which is like your own actions.
Yeah. Wait, so does part of you think that after a year of travel, you're going to go back into the corporate world and get a job? Or when you say back in North America, you mean back at home, editing all the footage at your parents' place and then getting ready to reboot your travel tour company? What's your plan after?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure, to be honest. Like, I know like the first month or so I'll be back at my parents' place just to like go, like put a close to this trip, like summarize the media, get the storytelling, everything organized. Because it's, I guess, an important chapter in my life, so I want to finish it, like close it properly. Then afterwards, honestly, it's an open book right now. I'm not exactly sure. Something I was gonna put more thought into, like in this year. There's a lot of options, like trying to set up more destinations, like for the travel company, finding a job again. Like I think working corporate would be the lowest of my priority. I mean, I don't have a good answer right now, but I'll probably figure it out as I go. And I guess that's another nice lesson for that I've learned while I've been traveling. It's usually I like to plan a lot of things, have everything under control. But of course, it doesn't always go that way. You kind of have to freestyle or figure stuff out as you go along. And it turns out at the end, like most things work out, right? Like you might not have a plan to get from A to B, but you still manage to get there somehow. And so I think that applies in life as well. Before like everyone has these plans, go to this school, get this job, get promoted to go to this industry or go to B school or whatever. And I had those plans too. But then when I quit my job, I think it was the first time I deviated from like what is the norm. And now I'm kind of figuring out my own life. And honestly, it's a bit scary because there's no set path, there's no sequence to follow. But it's also a bit more exciting, like feels like I'm traveling in my own life. And I'm confident that I have the skills to get to like whatever destination I end up in, like it'll be fine in the end.
Well, Terry, I want to thank you again for coming on. I know we've only actually talked once before this, but I feel like through following your travels, like I get a really good sense of who you are. And then from hearing you talk about travel and what it means to explore in today's age, and then also tying in the climate piece, it's been really good getting to know you better. And I know that our listeners and viewers will enjoy hearing your stories. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing and seeing what you put out there, because I know there's just so many stories that you're waiting to get home to be in the right environment to tell. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, and
hey, no
me,
problem. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Yeah, dude, it was just a great to hear your stories. I think a lot of it, really sticks with me because I also, sometimes I go on these 3-day trips and I think like, what's the point of traveling? And I get to already see images of the places where I'm going. So hearing about traveling the unknown and the fact that there's still so much in the world, like gets me really amped to go out there and explore a little bit more again. So this is going to be maybe a starting point for me to do like a little bit of a longer trip through some nature, and I'll definitely ping you if I need some travel advice there.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always happy to talk about and give advice. So just shoot me a message and I'll come up with some ideas and recommendations. I just love talking about travel. So.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you shared it. This is still a small podcast, so it is a huge help when someone shares an episode that they liked. Send it to your family, drop it in the group chat, or share it on social media. It means a lot to me and Abe, and we'll see you next time.